Professor Victor Hale thought humiliating a quiet, middle-aged woman in front of a livestream audience would be the easiest moment of his career. But before that lecture ended, the entire mathematics department would witness the exact second his arrogance began to collapse. The massive lecture hall at Blackwood University glowed beneath rows of warm chandelier lights, their reflections stretching across polished marble floors as students, professors, and visiting scholars filled nearly every seat in anticipation of the university's annual Advanced Calculus Symposium. At precisely 7 p.m., the low hum of conversation faded when Professor Victor Hale stepped onto the stage in a tailored navy suit, carrying himself with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. At 52, Hale was considered one of the most celebrated mathematical minds in the country. His research papers were quoted internationally, his lectures packed within minutes, and his reputation inside Blackwood bordered on untouchable. Tonight's symposium was especially important. Rumors had spread across academic circles that Hale was preparing to unveil a revolutionary theorem connected to nonlinear boundary transformations, a discovery many believe could secure him a multi-million-dollar research grant and a permanent place among America's elite mathematicians. Cameras positioned along the walls streamed the event live across educational platforms, while graduate students hurried between aisles carrying notebooks and laptops, desperate not to miss a single detail. Near the back entrance of the auditorium, unnoticed by almost everyone in the room, Claire Bennett quietly adjusted a stack of printed symposium handouts against her chest. At 41, Claire looked nothing like the distinguished academics surrounding her. Her soft gray cardigan hung loosely over a plain white blouse, and her light brown hair was tied back in a simple low ponytail. A pair of reading glasses rested gently on her nose as she moved carefully between rows, replacing missing papers and straightening chairs left crooked by students rushing to their seats. Most people at Blackwood assumed Claire was invisible. Officially, she worked as a library assistant in the mathematics department, organizing archives and repairing damaged journals deep beneath the university's basement stacks. Faculty members rarely remembered her name. Some never acknowledged her at all. Yet every night long after the campus emptied, Claire remained alone beneath dim fluorescent lights, surrounded by decades of mathematical research papers most students could barely understand. And while others saw a quiet woman shelving books, Claire spent countless silent hours studying equations that had consumed the greatest minds in academia. On stage, Victor Hale began his lecture with smooth authority, his deep voice echoing confidently across the hall as formulas illuminated the giant projection screen behind him. "Mathematics," he declared, "belongs to those willing to think beyond the limitations of ordinary minds." The audience nodded attentively while keyboards clicked rapidly throughout the room. Claire continued distributing handouts quietly until her eyes paused on one of the printed pages. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Near the center of Hale's featured proof, a transformation variable had been typed incorrectly. One symbol, one tiny error hidden inside 20 pages of advanced calculus. Most people would never notice it, but Claire did immediately. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping toward the side aisle leading to the stage. Her movements remained careful, respectful. "Professor Hale," she said softly once she reached the front row, holding the corrected page carefully in both hands. "I think there may be a printing mistake in section 4. Hale stopped speaking mid-sentence. Slowly, he turned toward the voice interrupting his presentation. The giant auditorium screens captured Claire instantly, projecting her modest appearance across every wall in the room. A few students exchanged amused smiles. Hale glanced briefly at the paper in her hands before his lips curled into a faint smirk. "And you are?" he asked. Claire swallowed lightly beneath hundreds of watching eyes. "Claire Bennett, sir. From the Mathematics Library Archives." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the hall. Hale adjusted his microphone, his amusement growing visible now. "The library assistant found an error in my theorem," he repeated loudly enough for the livestream audience to hear. More laughter followed. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the paper, but her voice remained calm. "I only thought you might want to double-check the transformation variable before continuing." Hale stared at her for a long moment, then slowly smiled toward the audience. "Well," he said smoothly, stepping away from the podium, "perhaps the librarian would like to teach calculus tonight instead." The room erupted into laughter as dozens of phones quietly lifted to record what everyone assumed was about to become a humiliating spectacle. But near the front row, one elderly visiting professor from MIT stopped laughing entirely. Because the moment Claire Bennett looked toward the enormous chalkboard behind Victor Hale, her eyes did not belong to someone who was confused. They belonged to someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. The laughter rolled across the auditorium in uneven waves, bouncing beneath the vaulted ceiling, while Claire Bennett remained standing near the front row with the corrected handout still trembling lightly between her fingers. Students leaned toward one another whispering sarcastic comments, and several graduate assistants lifted their phones higher, eager to capture what they assumed would become another embarrassing university moment uploaded online before midnight. Professor Victor Hale stood confidently beneath the stage lights, one hand resting casually against the podium as the smirk on his face widened. He had spent decades controlling rooms exactly like this one. To him, authority was not simply earned through intelligence. It was maintained through dominance, precision, and the public humiliation of anyone bold enough to challenge him. "Come on," Hale said into the microphone with theatrical politeness. "If you noticed an issue in the proof, perhaps you can explain it to all of us." More laughter followed. Claire hesitated only briefly before walking slowly toward the giant chalkboard at the center of the stage. Her flat shoes tapped softly against the polished wood floor while hundreds of eyes followed her every step. The massive projection screens displayed her image from every angle now, making her simple cardigan and nervous expression impossible to ignore. From the back rows, a student muttered, "This is going to be painful." Another quietly laughed. "She probably thinks calculus is balancing a checkbook." Near the front, however, Professor Leonard Graves from MIT watched Claire carefully without speaking. Unlike the others, he had noticed something strange moments earlier. Most people unfamiliar with advanced mathematics would not have recognized the variable inconsistency hidden inside Hale's theorem. In fact, many graduate students inside the room had completely missed it themselves. Yet Claire had spotted it within seconds while passing out papers. That detail unsettled him. On stage, Claire reached for a piece of chalk but did not write immediately. Instead, her eyes moved silently across the equations already covering the board. Hale folded his arms. "We are waiting, Miss Bennett." His tone carried enough amusement to trigger another ripple of laughter. Claire lowered her eyes politely. "I did not mean to interrupt your lecture, Professor." "And yet you did," Hale replied smoothly. "Fortunately for all of us, Blackwood encourages intellectual participation from every department, even the library archives." Several people chuckled louder at that. Claire nodded once, accepting the humiliation without argument. But deep inside, something older than embarrassment had already awakened. The equations on the board no longer looked intimidating to her. They looked familiar. Patterns began arranging themselves inside her mind with terrifying clarity, the same way they always had since she was a child sitting beside her father at the kitchen table solving advanced proofs, while other children struggled through basic algebra homework. Back then, numbers had never frightened Claire. People had. Years earlier, professors from some of the most prestigious universities in America had described her as a once-in-a-generation mathematical prodigy. At 20, she had already contributed unpublished work to theoretical calculus research under a private mentorship program at MIT. But life had not followed the path everyone expected. Her younger brother's illness, mounting medical bills, and the sudden loss of both parents within 18 months forced Claire to disappear from academia entirely. While former classmates pursued fame, grants, and recognition, Claire quietly took jobs that paid enough to survive. Over time, the academic world forgot her name completely. And eventually, Claire allowed herself to believe that was for the best. Now standing beneath the harsh stage lights at Blackwood University, she could feel the weight of old memories pressing against her chest, while Victor Hale watched impatiently from a few feet away. "Perhaps the theorem is too advanced," he suggested loudly. No shame in admitting that. The room laughed again, though not as confidently as before. Claire finally raised the chalk. Her hand steadied instantly. The subtle movement caught Professor Graves' attention immediately. Real mathematicians recognized confidence differently than ordinary people did. Not through arrogance, through stillness. Claire drew a single correction mark across the transformation variable, then quietly wrote 3 symbols beneath it. The laughter stopped almost immediately. Hale's expression flickered for less than a second before returning to forced amusement. But several faculty members in the front rows suddenly leaned forward at the exact same time. Because what Claire Bennett had just written was not random. It was the beginning of a correction that should not have been possible. The silence that settled across Blackwood University's grand auditorium felt heavier than the laughter that had filled it only seconds earlier. Claire Bennett stood motionless before the enormous chalkboard, the small piece of white chalk resting calmly between her fingers while rows of students stared upward at the symbols she had just written beneath Professor Victor Hale's theorem. At first glance, the correction looked almost insignificant. 3 symbols. 1 altered transformation path. But among the faculty seated near the front rows, expressions had already begun to shift. Several professors straightened in their chairs. One visiting scholar slowly removed his glasses as if he no longer trusted his own eyes. Professor Hale's smile remained fixed for the cameras, but a faint tension appeared along his jawline. "Interesting," he said carefully into the microphone. "Although I believe you may be misunderstanding the framework of the proof." Claire lowered the chalk politely. "No, sir," she answered softly. "The framework is correct. The inconsistency begins after the second boundary transition." A quiet murmur moved through the room. Hale turned toward the board, scanning the equations with visible irritation now. "That is impossible," he replied sharply. "The transformation was verified months ago." Claire nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. But the verification assumes continuity under conditions that collapse once the variable is corrected." Somewhere in the auditorium, a graduate student whispered, "What is she talking about?" Another replied nervously, "I think she is rewriting the entire proof." The livestream chat projected onto a side monitor began flooding rapidly with comments from viewers across the country. Some mocked Claire. Others suddenly demanded a closer camera angle of the board. Professor Leonard Graves remained completely still in his front row seat, his eyes locked on the equations as a slow realization crept across his face. He had spent nearly 30 years teaching advanced theoretical mathematics at MIT. And what Claire Bennett had just identified was not a beginner's observation. It was the kind of flaw only someone operating at the highest level of mathematical intuition could detect. On stage, Hale forced a short laugh. "Well," he announced confidently to the audience, "perhaps Miss Bennett would like to finish the derivation since she appears so certain." The sarcasm in his voice triggered scattered laughter again, but this time it sounded weaker. "Uncertain." Claire hesitated. The room watched her carefully now. Bright stage lights reflected softly across the polished black surface of the grand piano sitting and used beside the stage, while the massive projection screens magnified every small movement she made. For a brief moment, Claire considered stepping away. She had spent 20 years avoiding rooms exactly like this one. Rooms filled with ego disguised as brilliance. Rooms where intelligence was measured by titles, applause, and academic politics rather than truth itself. But then her eyes drifted back toward the theorem, and something inside her refused to leave the mistake untouched. Claire lifted the chalk again. Slowly, she stepped closer to the center of the board and began writing beneath Hale's equations. Her movements were calm, precise, methodical. She did not rush. Every symbol connected seamlessly to the next with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from complete understanding. The room grew stiller with each line she added. Graduate students who had been smirking minutes earlier now stared silently at their notebooks, struggling to follow calculations moving far beyond standard doctoral material. A young assistant professor near the aisle whispered under his breath, "No way." Another faculty member leaned toward him. "She is simplifying the collapse condition." "That cannot be done," he whispered back. "Apparently it can." Hale folded his arms tightly as Claire continued writing. At first, he searched for errors with visible impatience, then with concern, then with something dangerously close to panic. Because the direction of her proof was becoming impossible to ignore. Claire was not merely correcting a typo. She was dismantling the central assumption supporting his entire theorem. The auditorium had become so quiet now that the faint scratching of chalk against slate echoed through the hall like slow thunder. Phones lowered one by one. Even the livestream moderators stopped posting updates. Every eye remained fixed on the woman in the gray cardigan, quietly rewriting one of the university's most celebrated mathematical proofs in real time. And standing only a few feet away, Professor Victor Hale suddenly realized something that terrified him far more than public embarrassment. Claire Bennett was not guessing. Professor Victor Hale could feel the room slipping away from him one silent second at a time. The massive auditorium that normally responded to his lectures with admiration now sat frozen beneath the warm chandelier glow, every eye fixed not on him, but on Claire Bennett. She continued writing steadily across the enormous chalkboard, her gray cardigan sleeve lightly dusted with chalk as line after line of advanced calculus unfolded with terrifying elegance. The atmosphere inside Blackwood University had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, students had laughed at the quiet library assistant standing awkwardly beneath the stage lights. Now nobody laughed at all. The only sound remaining inside the hall was the soft scrape of chalk and the faint hum of camera equipment broadcasting the symposium live across the country. Claire paused briefly near the center of the proof and studied the equations in silence. Her calm expression never changed, but inside her mind the mathematics moved rapidly, each transformation revealing deeper structural weaknesses hidden inside Hale's celebrated theorem. She had seen this kind of mistake before. Brilliant mathematicians sometimes became so obsessed with proving themselves correct that they stopped testing whether they actually were. Pride blurred precision. Ego replaced discipline. And Victor Hale's entire proof was beginning to collapse beneath the weight of exactly that mistake. Near the front row, Professor Leonard Graves slowly leaned toward another visiting scholar from Stanford. "Do you understand what she is doing?" he whispered quietly. The professor stared at the board without blinking. "Unfortunately," he replied, "yes." Graves exhaled slowly. "Then Hale is in serious trouble." On stage, Hale stepped closer toward Claire, forcing a smile that no longer looked natural beneath the bright stage lights. "Miss Bennett," he interrupted carefully, "you are making assumptions outside the intended framework of the theorem." Claire turned slightly toward him, still holding the chalk. "No, sir," she answered gently. "I am following your framework exactly." A low murmur moved across the audience again. Hale's jaw tightened. That derivation was never meant to extend beyond the secondary transition model. Claire looked back at the board. "That is the problem," she replied quietly. "The model fails because the theorem assumes stability where there is none." Several graduate students immediately began typing furiously into laptops, trying to keep pace with her calculations. One young doctoral candidate stared at his screen in disbelief before whispering, "She is right." Another student shook his head nervously. If she is right, his entire publication falls apart. Across social media, clips from the live stream had already begun spreading rapidly. Thousands of viewers flooded educational forums asking the same question. Who is Claire Bennett? Yet standing in front of the giant chalkboard, Claire seemed completely unaware of the growing chaos outside the room. Her focus remained entirely on the equations. And with every new line she added, the atmosphere inside the auditorium became heavier. More serious. More dangerous for Victor Hale. Claire reached the final section of the theorem and slowly circled a single variable near the center of Hale's original proof. "This transition collapses under nonlinear continuity," she explained softly. "Once that happens, the final conclusion becomes mathematically impossible." The room went completely silent again. Hale stared at the board without moving. Sweat had begun gathering faintly along his temple despite the cool air circulating through the hall. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain, not publicly embarrassed, not irritated, afraid, because he understood exactly what Claire had just done. She had not merely identified an error. She had exposed a flaw buried deep enough to invalidate years of research. A flaw that peer reviewers, doctoral committees, and prestigious institutions had somehow missed entirely. Near the side aisle, one graduate assistant slowly lowered her phone and whispered, "This is unbelievable." But Professor Leonard Graves was no longer watching Claire with surprise. He was watching Victor Hale, because experienced mathematicians understood something the students did not yet realize. Claire Bennett was operating several levels beyond everyone else in the room. And if she continued, there was a very real possibility that one of the most respected academic reputations in America was about to collapse live in front of millions of people. The atmosphere inside Blackwood University's auditorium no longer resembled an academic lecture. It felt like the final seconds before a storm broke apart the sky. Professor Victor Hale stood rigid beneath the stage lights while Claire Bennett quietly erased one small section of the chalkboard and rewrote the transformation sequence from the beginning. The movement seemed simple, almost gentle, yet every mathematician in the room understood the devastating implication behind it. Claire was not patching a minor flaw anymore. She was rebuilding the foundation of the theorem itself. Rows of graduate students stared upward in stunned silence, their laptop screens glowing against the darkened auditorium as they attempted to follow calculations moving at a level most of them had never witnessed in person. Several professors exchanged nervous glances. Others avoided looking at Hale entirely. Near the front row, Professor Leonard Graves slowly leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable now. He had spent his entire career studying exceptional minds, and one truth had become painfully obvious to him over the last several minutes. Claire Bennett was not simply gifted. She was operating with the kind of instinctive mathematical vision that appeared perhaps once in a generation. On stage, Claire stepped aside slightly and studied the completed sequence in silence. Her breathing remained calm despite the crushing attention focused entirely on her. But deep inside, old memories had begun surfacing again. She remembered sitting alone in crowded lecture halls 20 years earlier while professors argued over equations she solved in minutes. She remembered prestigious universities competing for her research. She remembered nights at MIT when senior mathematicians gathered around chalkboards just to watch her work through impossible proofs from memory. And she remembered the exact moment she walked away from all of it. The phone call about her brother's condition. The hospital corridors that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. The scholarships she declined. The unfinished research papers abandoned inside desk drawers while she worked double shifts to keep her family alive. Over time, mathematics became something private, silent, hidden beneath ordinary life. She stopped introducing herself as a mathematician because eventually nobody asked anymore. Yet standing beneath the bright auditorium lights tonight, Claire could feel that forgotten part of herself waking up completely for the first time in years. Victor Hale cleared his throat sharply, attempting to regain control of the room. Even if your correction were theoretically interesting, he said carefully, it does not invalidate the practical conclusions of my work. Claire turned toward him slowly. Yes, it does, she replied softly. The room fell silent again. Hale forced a restrained smile. That is a bold claim. Claire looked back toward the board. The instability spreads through every dependent conclusion after Section 4. Once continuity fails, the predictive model cannot hold. A graduate student near the aisle whispered, "Oh my God." Another stared at the board in disbelief. She just dismantled the entire theorem. Hale stepped forward now, the polished confidence he carried earlier beginning to crack visibly around the edges. You are oversimplifying extremely advanced mathematics. Claire shook her head gently. No, Professor. I am simplifying it correctly. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Several students lowered their eyes immediately, while others stared openly at Hale's reaction. Somewhere in the back rows, a chair creaked loudly as someone shifted uncomfortably in the suffocating silence. The livestream viewer count continued climbing rapidly across the side monitors, comments flooding so quickly moderators could barely keep pace. Mathematicians from universities across the country had started joining the broadcast. Names from Stanford, Princeton, and MIT appeared in the discussion feed, asking the same stunned question. Who is Claire Bennett? Then suddenly, Professor Leonard Graves stood up. The sound echoed sharply through the silent auditorium. Every head turned toward the elderly MIT professor. As he adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Claire. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Then his expression slowly changed. Not confusion. Recognition. It cannot be, he whispered quietly beneath his breath. Claire's eyes met his for the first time all evening. And the moment Professor Graves saw the look on her face, the color drained from his own. Because 20 years earlier, before she vanished from academia without explanation, there had once been a young mathematical prodigy at MIT whose unpublished work terrified even senior professors. And standing before the chalkboard at Blackwood University, hidden beneath a gray cardigan and years of silence, Leonard Graves had just realized exactly who Claire Bennett truly was. The realization spread across Professor Leonard Graves' face slowly, like a man watching a ghost step out of the past and walk directly into the light. The enormous auditorium remained completely silent as he continued staring at Claire Bennett beside the chalkboard. Around him, students and faculty exchanged confused glances, unable to understand why one of the most respected mathematicians from MIT suddenly looked shaken. Claire lowered her eyes briefly the moment she recognized him. That single reaction confirmed everything. Graves took one slow step forward into the aisle. "Claire," he said quietly, almost disbelieving the sound of her name after so many years. A murmur instantly swept across the auditorium. Victor Hale looked sharply toward Graves. "You know her?" he asked. Graves did not answer immediately. His attention never left Claire. 21 years ago, he said slowly, MIT had a doctoral candidate who solved a nonlinear continuity problem that senior faculty had been struggling with for almost a decade. The room listened without breathing. She disappeared before publishing the work. Hale frowned impatiently. "What does that have to do with this?" Graves turned toward him at last. "Everything." Claire stood motionless beneath the stage lights while the weight of old memories pressed heavily against her chest. She had spent 2 decades building a quiet life far away from academic recognition. She repaired damaged textbooks, organized archives, helped students locate research journals. Most nights, nobody even looked at her twice while she pushed carts through the library basement beneath flickering fluorescent lights. And she preferred it that way, because brilliance attracted attention. Attention attracted expectations. And expectations eventually became unbearable when life forced you to choose between genius and survival. But now the walls she had built around herself were collapsing in front of millions of people. Hale folded his arms tightly, forcing irritation to mask the growing panic inside him. "Even if she studied mathematics years ago," he snapped, "that does not prove her conclusions are correct." Claire finally spoke again, her voice calm and almost apologetic. "Then test the proof." The simplicity of the answer hit the room harder than shouting ever could. Hale turned sharply toward the chalkboard, scanning every line Claire had written. His breathing slowed. His eyes moved faster now. One equation, then another, and with every passing second, the confidence drained further from his face. Because he could not find a mistake. Not one. The theorem he had spent years building was collapsing perfectly under Claire's correction. Near the back rows, several graduate students had already started rerunning the calculations independently on their laptops. One after another, their expressions changed from skepticism to shock. "It checks out," a student whispered. Another shook his head slowly. No, this cannot be happening." The livestream comments exploded so rapidly the side monitors began lagging behind. Academic forums across the country were already clipping segments from the symposium. Professors from Princeton, Stanford, and Caltech flooded the broadcast feed demanding copies of Claire's derivation. Meanwhile, Victor Hale remained frozen only a few feet away from the board that was dismantling his career in real time. Claire stepped closer to the final section of the theorem and quietly added one final sequence beneath Hale's original conclusion. The chalk moved steadily through her fingers with terrifying certainty. "Your predictive model only works if continuity survives the transition," she explained softly. "But mathematically, it cannot." She underlined the final expression once and lowered the chalk. Silence swallowed the room completely. Then Leonard Graves slowly approached the stage. His polished shoes echoed softly against the marble floor as he stopped beside the chalkboard and studied Claire's work from only inches away. The elderly MIT professor stared at the equations for several long seconds before finally removing his glasses with trembling hands. "My God," he whispered. "She solved it." A stunned gasp rippled across the auditorium. Victor Hale's face lost all color. Graves looked directly at him now, his expression no longer uncertain. "Professor Hale," he said carefully, "if this proof is correct, your theorem is not merely flawed." He paused heavily while the entire room waited. "It is mathematically impossible." The words landed across the auditorium like a collapsing ceiling. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And standing beneath the giant projection screens, Claire Bennett suddenly looked less like a quiet library assistant and more like the most dangerous mind anyone in that university had ever underestimated. The silence inside Blackwood University's grand auditorium stretched so long it became almost unbearable. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody whispered. The air itself seemed frozen beneath the golden chandelier light as Professor Leonard Graves' words continued echoing through the minds of everyone present. Mathematically impossible. On stage, Victor Hale stared blankly at the enormous chalkboard covered with Claire Bennett's corrections, his face pale beneath the projection screens broadcasting every detail of his unraveling expression to thousands of viewers across the country. For years, Hale had built his reputation on certainty. Students admired him because he never hesitated. Universities funded him because he always sounded convinced. But now, standing only feet away from a quiet woman he had publicly mocked less than an hour earlier, he looked like a man suddenly trapped inside a collapsing building he designed himself. Claire stepped away from the board slowly, placing the chalk down near the podium with careful gentleness. Her hands remained steady, but inside her chest emotions she had buried for decades were beginning to rise uncontrollably. Shame. Memory. Exhaustion. She never wanted this kind of attention again. Yet the mathematics had forced her hand. Truth had always mattered more to her than comfort. And tonight, the truth had become impossible to ignore. Near the center rows, students stared openly at Claire now with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The same graduate assistants who had quietly laughed at her cardigan and library badge earlier now looked almost afraid to speak in front of her. One doctoral student whispered softly, "We just watched a theorem collapse live." Another shook his head. "No, we watched a genius walk into the room." Along the side monitors, the livestream numbers continued climbing at astonishing speed. Clips of Claire rewriting the proof had already spread beyond academic circles into mainstream media feeds. Educational bloggers, science journalists, and university forums exploded with speculation about the mysterious woman at Blackwood University who had just dismantled one of the country's most anticipated mathematical breakthroughs. Yet Claire herself remained detached from all of it. She stood quietly beneath the bright stage lights, while Victor Hale finally forced himself to speak again. "This is not a formal peer review," he said sharply, though even he seemed unconvinced by his own voice now. "One impromptu derivation does not invalidate years of research." Leonard Graves looked toward him carefully. "No," he replied, "but correct mathematics does." A faint murmur moved through the auditorium. Hale's breathing grew heavier. "You are making conclusions far too quickly." Claire finally turned toward him again. Her expression held no anger, no triumph, only sadness. "Professor Hale," she said softly, "I did not want to embarrass you." The sentence hit the room harder than any insult could have, because everyone there understood the difference now. Victor Hale had tried to humiliate someone weaker than himself for entertainment. Claire Bennett had only corrected the mathematics. Hale looked away from her immediately, unable to hold eye contact any longer. Across the auditorium, several faculty members quietly exchanged tense whispers. A dean seated near the aisle had already stepped outside to answer urgent phone calls. Others refreshed academic forums on their phones, realizing Blackwood University was becoming the center of a national academic scandal in real time. Then Leonard Graves slowly approached the chalkboard again and pointed toward one section near the center of Claire's derivation. "This transition," he said carefully, addressing the room now, "was considered unsolvable under nonlinear instability conditions." He looked toward Claire with visible astonishment. "How did you see it?" Every eye turned toward her. Claire hesitated for several long seconds. Then she answered quietly, almost like someone remembering another lifetime. "I studied this model years ago." Graves shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "You mastered it." The room went silent again. A young graduate student near the back finally whispered the question everyone else was too stunned to ask aloud. If she was this brilliant, he looked toward Claire with confusion. Why was she working in the library basement? Nobody answered immediately. Claire lowered her eyes toward the marble floor beneath the stage lights, while old grief flickered briefly across her face. And in that painful silence, many people inside the auditorium realized something far more important than the collapse of Victor Hale's theorem. The greatest mind in the room had never cared about recognition at all. The question lingered in the auditorium long after the student stopped speaking. Why was she working in the library basement? The silence that followed felt different now. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of people realizing how little they truly understood about the woman standing quietly beneath the stage lights. Claire Bennett kept her eyes lowered for several seconds while the glow from the projection screens reflected softly across the marble floor around her feet. The giant chalkboard behind her remained covered in equations that had already begun spreading across academic forums all over the country. Yet despite everything that had just happened, Claire looked deeply uncomfortable with the attention surrounding her. Professor Leonard Graves watched her carefully before speaking in a softer tone. "Claire," he said, "people deserve to know what happened." She gave a faint shake of her head. "No," she replied quietly. "They really do not." Victor Hale remained frozen near the podium, his face pale as faculty members around the auditorium avoided looking directly at him. For the first time in his career, he stood in a room where his titles, awards, and authority meant absolutely nothing. Mathematics did not care about reputation. Equations did not bend for ego. And the audience that once admired him was now watching someone else entirely. Graves stepped closer to Claire. "You disappeared from MIT without warning," he said gently. "Half the department thought you were gone forever." Claire's expression tightened slightly at the memory. "My brother got sick," she answered softly. "There was nobody else to take care of him." The room remained perfectly still. "I tried to continue my research at first," she continued. "But hospital bills became more important than publishing papers." Several students lowered their eyes immediately. Claire looked toward the massive chalkboard again. "After he passed away, I did not really see the point anymore." Her words were calm, but the quiet grief inside them spread across the auditorium heavier than any dramatic speech could have. The room had gone so silent now that even the distant hum of the ventilation system sounded loud. Near the side aisle, one graduate student slowly closed his laptop. Another discreetly wiped at his eyes. Because suddenly the woman everyone mocked less than an hour earlier no longer looked invisible at all. She looked extraordinary. Leonard Graves removed his glasses again, visibly emotional now. "Do you understand how many people search for you?" he asked quietly. Claire smiled faintly, almost sadly. "That was exactly why I stayed hidden." Victor Hale finally spoke again, though his voice sounded weaker than anyone had ever heard before. "You could have returned to academia any time." Claire turned toward him. "Maybe," she replied gently. "But not everyone measures success the same way." The answer landed heavily across the room. Hill looked down immediately, because deep inside, he knew she was right. He had spent years chasing recognition so aggressively that somewhere along the way he stopped respecting the very thing mathematics required most: humility. Across the livestream feeds, comments shifted dramatically now. Earlier viewers had mocked Claire's appearance and laughed at her cardigan. Now the entire internet seemed united in admiration. Educational pages called her a forgotten genius. News outlets demanded interviews. Universities began contacting Blackwood administrators in real time, asking for information about Claire Bennett. Yet standing beneath all the attention she never asked for, Claire appeared untouched by it. Her eyes drifted quietly across the students seated throughout the auditorium. Nervous young mathematicians, overworked graduate assistants, teenagers desperate to prove themselves worthy in a world obsessed with prestige. Claire recognized that pressure because she once carried it herself. Slowly, she walked toward the edge of the stage and looked out across the silent hall. "Mathematics is supposed to be about truth," she said softly. "Not status, not applause, not making people feel small." Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. "The moment intelligence becomes about ego," she continued, "people stop learning." Tears filled the eyes of one student seated near the front row. Another lowered his head in shame, remembering how quickly he had laughed at her earlier. And somewhere near the back of the auditorium, a young freshman quietly closed the phone she had used to record Claire's humiliation. Because she suddenly understood she had just witnessed something far more important than the destruction of a theorem. She had witnessed what real brilliance actually looked like. The grand auditorium at Blackwood University remained completely silent long after Claire Bennett finished speaking. Hundreds of students sat motionless beneath the warm chandelier light, surrounded by scattered notebooks and glowing laptop screens. Yet nobody seemed interested in equations anymore. Something far more important had unfolded inside that room. The giant chalkboard behind Claire still carried the proof that dismantled Professor Victor Hale's theorem line by line, but now it felt almost secondary compared to the quiet dignity standing in front of it. Claire looked across the audience one final time before gently stepping away from the center of the stage. The same marble floor that had echoed with laughter when she first walked forward now carried only silence as she moved toward the exit aisle. No dramatic celebration followed her. No triumphant smile. No arrogance. And somehow, that made the moment even more powerful. Near the front row, Professor Leonard Graves slowly stood to his feet. The movement broke the silence like the first drop of rain before a storm. Then another professor stood beside him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose together in a standing ovation so overwhelming it seemed to shake the walls of the hall itself. Students who had mocked Claire earlier now clapped harder than anyone, many with tears in their eyes. Some faculty members looked openly ashamed. Others stared at Claire with a kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. Yet Claire herself stopped only briefly near the aisle. She turned back toward the room with visible discomfort at the attention. "Please," she said softly over the applause, "save that energy for people who are still learning." The ovation slowly quieted. Across the stage, Victor Hale remained standing alone beside the podium, surrounded by the ruins of his collapsed theorem and his own silence. For the first time in decades, he looked small, not because Claire humiliated him, but because his own arrogance had finally been exposed in front of everyone. Hale glanced toward the chalkboard one last time before quietly lowering his eyes. He understood now that the most painful part of the night was not losing academic prestige. It was realizing he had mocked someone whose brilliance far exceeded his own simply because she looked ordinary. Near the side aisle, several university administrators had already begun discussing emergency meetings and public statements. Academic journals were requesting copies of Claire's derivation. Prestigious universities across the country were sending direct messages to Blackwood within minutes. Yet Claire ignored all of it. Recognition no longer held power over her the way it once had. As she reached the auditorium doors, Leonard Graves called after her gently. "Claire." She paused. Graves smiled faintly, emotion visible behind his tired eyes. "The world never forgot your mind," he said quietly. Claire looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe," she replied softly. "But I learned a long time ago that being remembered is not the same thing as being at peace." Graves nodded slowly, understanding more than anyone else in the room. Claire gave him one final grateful smile before stepping through the doors and disappearing into the quiet university hallway beyond the auditorium lights. Inside the hall, nobody moved for several seconds after she left. The room that once echoed with smug laughter now felt humbled by its own silence. One young student near the back slowly closed his calculus notebook and whispered, "I hope I become half the mathematician she is." Another student beside him shook her head gently. "Not just the mathematician," she said. "The person." On stage, Victor Hale remained alone beneath the giant projection screens while staff quietly powered down cameras around him. The live stream that was supposed to celebrate his greatest academic triumph had instead captured the exact moment pride collapsed in front of humility. And somewhere deep beneath Blackwood University, inside the quiet library basement where nobody important ever bothered to look, stacks of unfinished research journals still waited beneath fluorescent lights for the woman who had never needed recognition to prove her worth. Because that night, everyone inside Blackwood finally learned something no equation could ever fully explain. Intelligence may impress the world for a moment, but humility is what makes people unforgettable.